It is a deep and quiet night. Today I will tell you the story of Baekbeom Kim Gu, an ordinary man born in the lowest of places who wished to become the gatekeeper of his country. A passionate record of a 17-year-old boy who, disillusioned by a corrupt world, resolved to become a person with a good heart rather than a good face, and walked into the rough waves of history. The honest confession of the most inadequate person living as a member of the nation, Baekbeomilji. Let us quietly turn its first page. Please listen comfortably. Baekbeomilji, 1947. Author Kim Gu. This is Kim Gu's autobiography. There are broadly 4 versions of Baekbeomilji. They include the original handwritten manuscripts completed by Kim Gu in 1929 and 1942, 2 transcribed copies of them, and the National History Original Edition, Kuksawonbon, officially published in 1947. The National History Original Edition refers to the 1947 book edited and polished by Lee Guangsu. Baekbeomilji was reborn through the embellishment of Lee Guangsu, a renowned writer. The National History Original Edition of Baekbeomilji started with fluent sentences and an easy, concise style from the beginning. It is a work that differs greatly from the original handwritten Baekbeomilji. When Baekbeom's son, Kim Shin, revealed the original handwritten manuscript in 1994, the differences from Lee Guangsu's polished version could be confirmed. It well describes the history of the Korean independence movement, befitting the president of the Provisional Government, but it has also faced criticism for having prejudices against socialism, such as omitting mentions of the independence movements by socialists and instead only mentioning the shooting incident of the Goryeo Communist Party. Starting with the first edition published by the National History Institute on December 15, 1947, led by his son Kim Shin, about 10 editions have been reprinted domestically and internationally to this day. However, because it was written solely by tracing memories without materials or assistance, there are many cases where the narrative details and timing contradict each other, such as distortions or exaggerations like the Chihapo incident, and there are also errors in people's names and place names. Author's words. This book is a translation of the writings I made when I was in Shanghai and Chongqing into the national language, Korean, in accordance with Korean orthography. At the end, I wrote down what happened after returning to my home country. The reason I initially thought of writing this was out of the motive to inform my 2 young sons, who were in my home country at the time, about the things I experienced when I became the president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai and began a dangerous task where I did not know when death would befall my body. What was written like this in place of a will is the first volume of this book, and the second volume was written to convey my plans and thoughts on the national independence movement, mainly keeping in mind our compatriots in the Americas and Hawaii, as following the Yunbong-gil righteous deed incident and as a result of the Sino-Japanese War, we lost both the base and the opportunity for the independence movement, survived with no place to throw our lives away, and came to wait for another opportunity. But by then, I was already looking at 70 with not many days ahead. This too can be called a will. I did not even dream that I would return alive to my home country and publish this book. I wanted this to be seen by the eyes of our compatriots as a story of the past after our fully independent nation was established. However, whether I should call it fortunate or unfortunate, the work of independence has not yet been achieved, and only my undying life remained to return to my home country and present this book before my compatriots. So my emotions are truly immeasurable. A few friends who love me suggested that publishing this book would bring some benefit to our compatriots, so I permitted it. To publish this book, a publishing house was set up within the National History Institute, and Kim Ji-rim and my 3rd cousin Hongdu are handling the editing, reservations, and repairs. I express my gratitude to various friends and institutions who exerted effort and worked hard, whether in translating and correcting Korean orthography, providing funds and paper, or printing. The piece My Wish, attached at the end, notes the essence of what I want to say to our nation. For a country to stand and a nation to lead a national life, there must be a foundational philosophy. Without this, the people's thoughts cannot be unified, and they will lean towards the philosophy of this country or be drawn to the philosophy of that nation, failing to maintain independence of thought and spirit, relying on others, and showing disgraceful behavior among themselves. Looking at our current situation, some believe in Locke's philosophy, and these are those who want to move Washington to Seoul, and some believe in the philosophies of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and these are those who want to make Moscow our soul. Neither Washington nor Moscow can be our soul, nor should they be. If there is anyone who claims such a thing, that person would be no different from those in the past who wanted to make Tokyo our soul. Our soul must only be our soul. We must find, establish, and assert our own philosophy. The day we realize this is the day our compatriots truly possess an independent spirit and truly become independent. My wish is included with this motive and in this meaning. In other words, I have written down the grand principles of our national philosophy that I harbor and believe in. Therefore, I hope that all my compatriots will read this piece carefully and use it as a reference and a stimulus to find and establish their own national philosophy. Most of the comrades appearing in this book have survived and are dedicating themselves to the work of independence, but many have already passed away. Choi Kwang-ok, An Chang-ho, Yang Gi-tak, Hyun Ik-chol, Yi Dong-yong, Cha Yi-sok, they are all gone now. All who are born must die, so it cannot be helped. But even while individuals are born and die, the life of the nation is always there and always young. We must build a fortress wall with our corpses to protect our independence, make a footstool of our corpses to elevate our descendants, and use our corpses as fertilizer to let our culture bloom and bear fruit. I feel satisfied and grateful that the comrades who passed away before me have all done these things. Though I am old, I will not let this body rot in vain. Our country is my country, not other people's country. Independence is something I do, not something someone else does separately. If all 30 million of our people realize this principle and act accordingly, our country's independence cannot fail to be achieved, and this country cannot fail to be preserved as a good and great nation. This is what I, Kim Gu, have thought and practiced all my life. I know very well that I am an inadequate person. However, no matter how inadequate I am, I believe in the fact that I am one of the people and one of the nation, so I have unceasingly done what I can do. This is my life, and the record of that life is this book. Therefore, the reason I agreed to publish this book is not because I am a great person, but because this book is a record of how an inadequate person lived as a member of the nation. My pen name, Baekbeom, signifies this. If there is anything I have contributed even a little to the national independence movement, it is something that anyone who is Korean can do if they only try. I believe that truly great and excellent patriots and great figures who do tremendously shining deeds will pour out from among our young men and women. But at the same time, what I desire even more earnestly is that each and every one will know this country as their own and exert all their strength for this country throughout their lives. I am sending this autobiography of an ordinary person to compatriots who share this intent. Danganera 4280, November 15th, National Foundation Day. Kim Gu, Volume 1. Preface. To my two young sons, In and Shin. Your father is now writing this from a distant country, 5,000 rai, away by land and water from the hometown where you are. Since I cannot sit you young ones down in front of me and tay all you these things, I have roughly recorded my past affairs to leave with a few comrades, asking them to show it to you in the future when you grow up and wish to know your father's experiences. It is a pity that I cannot speak to you directly because you are still young. But how can worldly affairs go as one wishes? My age is already 53, but you are now only 10 and 7 years old. By the time your age and knowledge grow, my spirit and energy will have already declined. And since this body has already declared war against our enemy, the Japanese, and now stands on the line of death, how can I trust my life to wait for the day when you grow up and we can speak face to face? That is why I am writing this down now. The reason I record my experiences and leave them to you is certainly not to tell you to emulate me. What I sincerely hope is that, since you too are citizens of the Republic of Korea, You will choose the one most worthy of reverence among the numerous great figures of the East and West, ancient and modern, and serve them as your teacher. Even when you grow up, there would be no way for you to know your father's experiences, which is why I write this. The only regrettable thing is that because what is written in this book are all old events, it is true that many have been forgotten, but it is also true that nothing has been added or fabricated, so I hope you believe it. Year 11 of the Republic of Korea, May 3rd, from your father in Shanghai, China. Our family and my childhood. We are descendants of King Gyeongsun of the Andong Kim clan. How the last king of Silla, King Gyeongsun, became the son-in-law of Princess Nangnang, the daughter of King Taejo Hwanghae of Goryeo, and thus became our ancestor, can be found in the Samguk Sagi, or the genealogy of the Andong Kim clan. The 8th generation descendant of King Gyeongsun was Duke Cheongnyeol, and Duke Cheongnyeol's great-great-grandson was Duke Igwon, who is the progenitor of our branch, and I am the 21st generation descendant of Duke Igwon. Both Duke Cheongnyeol and Duke Igwon were meritorious subjects of the Goryeo dynasty, and even entering the Joseon dynasty, our ancestors lived in Seoul for generations, taking scholarship and government posts as their family profession. Then, our distant collateral ancestor Kim Jae-jeom was accused of treason, and the family suffered the disaster of extermination. At that time, the elder, who was my 11th generation great-grandfather, fled Seoul with his wife and children to seek temporary exile in his hometown. But since it was close to Seoul and unsafe, he sought a place to hide at the foot of Yanggabong in Palbongsan, Baigunbong, 80 ri west of Haeju City. At the ancestral burial ground in Dwitgae there, the ancestral graves of consecutive generations, starting with the graves of my 11th generation great-grandparents, are located, and my grandmother is also laid to rest in this burial ground. At that time, the only way for our family to escape the disaster of extermination was to hide the appearance of Yangban, nobility, and act as Sangnam, commoners. When they first came to Teokgol, our ancestors worked as farmers, cultivating wasteland in the guise of peasants, and once they began farming land designated for military duty, they completely wore the badge of commoners. By law, those who farmed this land had to serve as soldiers whenever the country called, and at that time, the country elevated the civil and lowered the military. So being a soldier was considered a lowly duty or a lowly job. It goes without saying that this was a great cause of our country's decline. In this way, as textbook commoners, we were subjected to generations of contempt and oppression from the Jinju Kang clan and Deoksu Lee clan, who acted as nobles in the vicinity of Teotgol. There were instances where daughters of our clan married off to them, but we never married their daughters. However, in the middle years, our family seemed to have prospered quite a bit, so there were rows of tile-roofed houses on our site in Teotgol, and there were also many large stone monuments at the ancestral graves. Even when I was a little over 10 years old, a man named Lee Jung-gil always came to manage things whenever there was a major event in our clan. They said this man was originally a slave of our family who had been emancipated, so one could only say he had a truly cruel fate to be born as a slave to a commoner family like ours. Looking back at the generations since we came to live in Haeju, there were those who studied, but none were famous, and there were always many discontented individuals. I heard from family elders that my great-grandfather acted as an imposter royal inspector and was imprisoned in the Haeju provincial office, but managed to escape punishment by obtaining a favor letter from some noble in Seoul. A secret royal inspector is an official title given by the king to a trusted young official with terrifying power to tour the countryside to understand local conditions, and it is customary to travel disguised as a shabby wanderer. Among the 4 of my great-grandfather's generation, one survived until I was 5 or 6 years old. My grandfather and his brothers were all alive, and my father's 4 brothers were all living until my eldest uncle Baekbeom passed away shortly after, and I remember wailing with my older cousins when I was 5 years old. My father, whose given name was Sun Yong, was the second of 4 brothers. Because the family was poor, he could not marry and remained an old bachelor until he was 24. Through a bizarre method of a triangular marriage, He married the 14-year-old daughter of the Hyunpong Kwak clan living in Jangyeon, lived with my granduncle's family, and became independent 2 or 3 years later, which was when I was born. At that time, my mother was 17 years old, and she always said her conception dream was obtaining one red chestnut from inside a green chestnut burr and hiding it. It was me who was born at midnight on July 11th of the Beomilji year. This day was my grandmother's Memorial Day, at the large house by the puddle in Teotgol, where my grandfather and eldest uncle lived. Perhaps it was a premonition that my life would be rough. It was an unprecedentedly difficult birth. Even after 6 or 7 days of labor, the birth did not progress normally, and my mother's life was in danger. They tried all kinds of medicines and preventatives to no avail, and finally, coerced by the elders, my father put a cow's pack saddle on his head, climbed onto the roof, and made cow noises before I finally came out. My mother, who was barely 17, was so annoyed by me that she cried out wishing I would just die quickly. Her milk dried up, so I was fed rice gruel, and my father carried me in his bosom, begging for breast milk from mothers with babies to feed me. Hearing that a distant relative, a grandaunt from Pitgay, fed me without any sign of reluctance even in the middle of the night, I always paid my respects when passing her grave after she passed away when I was just over 10 years old. It was when I was 3 or 4 years old that I suffered from smallpox, and my mother extracted the pus from the pustules on my body using a bamboo needle she usually used for boils, which is why I have thick pockmarks on my face. When I was 5, my parents took me and moved to the Gangneung three-way intersection. There were mountains behind it and the sea in front. Because the families of my granduncle, second granduncle, and third granduncle all moved there, our family followed. We lived there for 2 years, and our house was so secluded that a tiger bit a person and passed right in front of our door. Our house was located at the entrance to the mountain on the tiger's path. Therefore, we couldn't step out of the door at night. During the day, my parents went out to farm or catch things in the say, and my daily routine was to go to the nearby house of Lee Sang-won, play with the children there, and come back. Among those children, there was one my age, but there were also kids 2 or 3 years older. Conspiring to beat up this Haeju punk, I was ignorantly beaten up once. Furious, I returned home, grabbed a large kitchen knife from the kitchen, and went back to Lee Sang-won's house, tearing down the fence with the intention of ambushing and stabbing them all to death. However, their 17 or 18-year-old daughter saw me and screamed for her brothers, so I failed to achieve my goal, was caught by them, beaten up soundly, had the knife taken away, and returned home. Terrified of being beaten by my parents for losing the kitchen knife, I feigned ignorance even when my mother was looking for it. Another day, while I was alone at home, a taffy seller passed by the door shouting, "Buy taffy with old brassware or broken spoons." I wanted to eat taffy, but having heard from adults that taffy sellers cut off children's penises, I tightly locked the door. Then I called the taffy seller, stepped on and broke my father's intact spoon, kept half and pushed only half out through the peephole. I thought it had to be a broken spoon for him to give me taffy. The taffy seller took the half spoon I offered and shoved a handful of taffy through the hole. While I was happily eating the taffy with the half spoon beside me, my father returned. I told him the truth, and he only scolded me, saying I would be in big trouble if I did it again, but he didn't hit me. Once again, around that time, I saw my father put a string of 20 nangs inside the bedding on the warm floor. When my father was out and I was alone, feeling bored, I thought I would go to the street shops outside the village to buy some rice cakes. I took out the entire string of 20 nyang, wrapped it around my waist, and stepped out the door. After going a little way, I happened to meet my third granduncle coming to our house. "You brat, where are you going with money?" My third granduncle blocked my path. "Going to buy rice cakes," I answered nonchalantly. "If your father sees this, you'll be beaten. Hurry back home," he said, taking the money wrapped around my body and giving it to my father. Feeling quite disgruntled for not being able to buy the rice cakes I wanted, I was sitting at home when my father entered right after. Without a word, he tied me tightly with a clothesline, hung me from the beam, and whipped me mercilessly. It hurt to death. My mother hadn't returned from the fields yet, so there was no one to stop him, and I just hung there, taking the beating. Just then, my second granduncle, whom we called the Jangnyeon grandfather, came in. He practiced medicine and cherished me. It was truly a stroke of luck for me that he was passing by our house, heard me screaming and crying, and rushed in. The Jangnyeon grandfather unhesitatingly brought me down from the beam before asking my father the reason. Without even listening completely to my father explaining my crime, the Jangnyeon grandfather, though the same age as my father, used the authority of an uncle to snatch the whip my father was using and struck my father's head and legs indiscriminately for a while, before finally reprimanding him. How can you beat a child so mercilessly? It felt so good to see my father getting beaten, and I was so grateful to the Jangnyeon grandfather. My great-grandaunt, who was the Jangnyeon grandfather's mother, also heard from her son the reason I was beaten by my father and said, "Your father is hateful. Don't go home. Let's live in our house." She repeatedly scolded my father's wrongdoing and prepared delicious rice and side dishes for me. I can't describe how happy I felt, and thinking of my father being beaten by that grandfather was incredibly satisfying. I stayed at this house for several days like this before returning home. Once it rained heavily during the monsoon season, and springs gushed out nearby, forming several small streams. I brought out red and blue dye pots from home and playfully released red into one stream and blue into another, enjoying the sight of the red and blue streams meeting and mixing together. But I got a severe beating from my mother for it. Perhaps because my granduncle passed away here, and the arduous funeral procession carrying his bier over 100 rai back to his hometown of Haeju became the cause. By the time I turned 7, the relatives who lived here began returning to our hometown in Haeju, one by one. I remember being carried on the backs of adults when our family also returned to Teokgol during this commotion. Back in our hometown, our family made a living by farming. Although my father's education was only around the level of writing his name, he had a good physique, a bold temperament, and an infinite capacity for alcohol. Whenever he met people from the Kang or Lee clans, he would beat them up, leading him to be arrested and imprisoned in the Haeju provincial office several times a year, causing uproar in the clan. The local Yangbands hated my father, but seemed helpless against him. At that time, the rural custom was that if someone beat another and caused injury, the beaten person would be carried to the house of the attacker and laid down, waiting to see if he would live or die. So in our house, there were times when severely beaten and bloody people on the verge of death were brought in and laid in the guest room several times a month. Even if my father's beatings were done while drunk, they all stemmed from some grievance. Even if the person had nothing to do with him, when my father saw Yangbands or the strong bullying the weak, he couldn't hold back, and in the style of the heroes in Water Margin, beat them up regardless of whether they were close to him or not. Knowing my father's fiery temperament, the local commoners feared and respected him, while the Yangbands were afraid and avoided him. Every year at the end of the year, my father prepared many things like eggs and tobacco and presented them to the petty officials and guards of the provincial office. In return, almanacs and Haeju ink sticks would come back. This was a countermeasure against Yangbands like the Kangs and Lees sucking up to the governor or magistrate. Being on friendly terms with the petty officials or guards was called gibang, alliance. If this alliance was formed, even if my father was arrested by the governor's office or the main office and imprisoned, the imprisonment was in name only. In reality, the officials and guards showed favoritism, so he shared a room and meals with them comfortably. Furthermore, even if he was subjected to flogging, the guards would just pretend to hit hard, and the person being hit only had to pretend to be dying in agony. Moreover, if my father countersued the Yangbans and they were brought in, no matter how many bribes they gave the governor or magistrate to avoid trouble, my father's allies, the petty officials, would punish them severely and waste a lot of their wealth. I heard that more than 10 wealthy families were ruined this way in a year. Perhaps to appease my father, the Yangbans who feared him nominated him as Dojonwi, a local headman. However, when my father performed his duties as Dojonwi, Unlike other dojonwis, he was mercilessly strict with the yangbans and generous to the poor and lowly. When collecting taxes, there were times when he paid out of his own pocket for the poor, but he was never harsh on them. Because of this, in less than 3 years, my father was dismissed from his post for allegedly embezzling public funds. So my father was shunned and hated by the neighboring yangbans, and even their wives and sons shuddered at the mere sound of the name Kim Sun-young. My father's childhood nickname was Hyoja, filial son. This originated from the fact that when my grandmother, R, was dying, my father cut his left ring finger with a knife and let the blood drip into her mouth, which revived her and allowed her to live for 3 more days. Among my father's 4 brothers, my eldest uncle, Baekbeom, was an ordinary farmer, and my third uncle didn't have anything special to note either, but my fourth uncle, Junyoung, was quite peculiar, like my father. Uncle Junyoung couldn't even learn the letter Giok during a whole winter of learning the Korean alphabet, but he drank immeasurably and had a terrible drinking habit. Whenever he got drunk, he always caused a disturbance. While my father strictly directed his drunken rages at yangbans, Uncle Junyoung, no matter how drunk he was, never dared touch the yangbans and only attacked our relatives. I remember him getting beaten by my grandfather because of this. When I was 9, my grandfather passed away. On the day of the funeral, this uncle caused a scene with the pallbearers, and eventually they had to tie him up before proceeding with the funeral. After the funeral, at the proposal of my great-granduncle, a family meeting was held. Concluding that they couldn't just let such immoral behavior continue and needed to severely punish him to prevent future trouble, they decided to cripple Uncle Junyoung by cutting his heels. However, doing it in a fit of anger, they didn't cut all the tendons, so he didn't become completely crippled. But as he lay in the guest room of my grandfather's house roaring like a tiger, I remember being so terrified that I couldn't even go near there. Thinking about it now, I can't help but say it was the behavior of commoners. At that time, my mother said this to me: "All the turmoil in your house is because of alcohol. If I see you drinking alcohol later on, I will commit suicide so I don't have to see you like that." I deeply engraved these words in my mind. Around this time, I had learned the Korean alphabet and could read storybooks, and I had learned and mastered the 1,000-character classic by asking this person and that. However, there was a specific motive behind my determination to study letters. One day I heard this story from the adults. It was a few years ago. There was a newlywed family in our clan. A grandfather had bought a gat, traditional horsehair hat worn by nobles, during a trip to Seoul and kept it. He wore it at night to greet his new in-laws, but the yangbans discovered it, the hat was destroyed, and since then, our Kim clan was never allowed to wear a gat again. I cried bitterly upon hearing this, and I asked how those people became yangbans and how we became sangnoms. The adult's answer was this: even the ancestors of the Kang clan at Baekbeom were no better than our ancestors, but they had 3 jinsa, literary licentiates, living in their family, and the same was true for the Lee clan at Jaraso. I asked how one becomes a jinsa. The answer was that to become a jinsa, or pass the highest civil service exam, one just needs to study hard, become a great scholar, and pass the civil service examination. After hearing this, I strongly felt the desire to study. So I nagged my father to send me to a village school, Seodang. However, my father could not help but hesitate. There was no school in our village, so the only way was to go to the Yangban school in the neighboring village. But it was uncertain whether the Yangban school would accept me, and even if I entered, it didn't seem like I could endure the bullying from the Yangban children. So, unable to quickly make a decision, he finally gathered the children from our village and the commoner children from the neighboring village, created a new school, and decided to bring in a Yangban named Lee Sang-won from Cheongsuri as the teacher. This person was of noble status, but because his scholarship was poor, no Yangban school would take him, which is why he came to ours. On the day Teacher Lee was to arrive, I combed my hair, changed into new clot, he's, and followed my father out to meet him. A tall old man looking about 50 was approaching from afar. My father greeted him first and then said to me, "Changam, bow to the teacher." I bowed politely and deeply, and looking up at the teacher, I didn't know whether to call him a divine being or God. He looked so incredibly holy. First, we set our guest room as the schoolroom, and our family decided to serve the teacher his meals. At that time, I was 12 years old. On the first day of school, I learned the 5 characters Ma Sang Bong Han Sik, meeting the cold food festival on horseback. Whether I knew the meaning or not, I kept reciting it out of joy. Even at night, while helping my mother peel wheat, I kept reciting it. At dawn, I would get up early, go to the teacher's room, learn before anyone else, and teach my friends who came from far away carrying their rice bowl nets. After 3 months of this at our house, the school was moved to the guest room of Shin Jonwi's house in the mountain valley, so I commuted over the hill carrying my rice bowl net. From home to school and from school to home, the sound of reciting texts never left my lips. Among my classmates, there were kids at a higher level than me, but when it came to reciting what we had learned, I was always the top student. After half a year of this, discord arose between the teacher and Shin Jonwi, eventually leading to Teacher Lee being sent away. The reason Shin Jonwi gave was that Teacher Lee ate too much, but the truth was that his own son was slow-witted and studying poorly, while he was jealous of my rapid progress. Once, during the Wolgang monthly test, the teacher quietly asked me a favor. Since I always came in first, he asked me to intentionally do poorly this time and pretend not to know even if the teacher asked the meaning. I promised I would, and did so. Thus, Shin Jonwi's son took first place for the first time that day. Shin Jonwi was very pleased, slaughtered a chicken, and threw a great feast. However, the fact that Teacher Lee was rejected for the crime of not being able to make Shin Jonwi's son come in first every time, one truly has to call it the behavior of a commoner. One day, before breakfast, the teacher came to our house to say goodbye. My mind went blank, and I clung to his embrace and cried out loud. The teacher also shed tears like rain. For a few days, I hardly ate and only cried. After that, another traveling teacher was brought in to continue my studies. But this time, my father suddenly became completely paralyzed and bedridden, so I had to abandon my studies and run errands for him. On top of our inherently poor livelihood, spending a fortune on doctors and medicine, we felt it was a stroke of luck that my father, having barely survived, was left half paralyzed, able to use one arm and one leg. However, since my father couldn't survive as a half-paralyzed man, my mother decided she must cure his illness no matter what, and set off on a penniless journey with him. The plan was to beg from door to door while searching for renowned doctors to cure her husband's illness. Our house and even the iron cauldron were sold off, and I was left in the care of my eldest aunt, spending my days leading cows across mountains and fields with my cousins. Missing my parents unbearably, I wandered around Sincheon, Anak, and Jangyeon following their journey. Then, I was left at the house of a 6th cousin in Daecheon, Jangyeon, while my parents alone went to our hometown to perform the final memorial service for my grandfather. Since that house was also a farming family, I went with them to Mount Guwol to cut wood. Being unusually small for my age, when I carried a load of wood, it looked as if the load of wood was walking by itself. Moreover, experiencing such hard labor for the first time was painful enough. But there was a large school in that village, and whenever I heard the sound of reciting texts day and night, I couldn't help feeling unspeakable sorrow. While my parents were wandering, my father's illness miraculously improved, and he became able to use his paralyzed limbs, albeit not perfectly. So they returned to our hometown with the goal of letting me study. Returning home, there was nothing to rely on for food, clothing, or shelter, but relatives chipped in a little each to set up a household, and I went to school again. Even if I borrowed books to read, there was no money for paper, brushes, and ink. When my mother sold her labor on the road and in weaving to buy me writing materials, I was so grateful that I could not express it in words. When I turned 14, all the people called teachers were so pedantic that they didn't satisfy me. I evaluated a teacher's academic ability based on whether their tuition fee was 10 sacks of rice or 5 sacks. Not only did they lack literary skills, but their mindset and the way they worked showed no qualifications to be someone's teacher. At that time, my father said this to me. He said that begging is best done by singing market songs. So don't try too hard to achieve great scholarship, but just learn practical writing. He told me to learn how to write land deeds like Umyeongmunpyosadan, petitions like Ugeunjin Sojidan, memorial addresses like Yuschagamso Gohu, marriage letters like Bokjijegi Jami Yuhangnyo, and letters like Bongmisim Chasi. So I studied this in my spare time, became the best writer in our ignorant village, and the clan expected that I would at least become a Janwi, local headman, in the future. However, my writing was only at the level of popular prose, and my ambition was not just to be a village headman. When I read the Tongam and Sariak, seeing Chen Sheng's words that kings, nobles, generals, and ministers are not of a special seed, Liu Bang's story of drawing his sword and slaying the snake, or the deeds of Han Xin, who begged for food from a washerwoman, I unwittingly felt a surge of heroic spirit. However, with our family's financial situation, we couldn't seek out an illustrious teacher, and my father seemed very worried. But fortunately, a path to study opened up. About 10 rai northeast of our village, in a place called Hakgol, a man named Jong Moon-jae was teaching. His social standing was Sangnom like our family, but his composition skills for the civil service exam made him one of the top scholars of the time, so scholars flocked to him from all directions. Since teacher Jong was second cousins with my eldest aunt, my father pleaded with him and got permission for me to commute and learn without paying tuition. Thus, every day I carried my rice bowl net and walked the rugged Tenri mountain path, often arriving before the boarding students had even woken up. My compositions were the 18 phrases of the Daegopung, an introductory style for the civil exam. The curriculum included Handangsi, Donghak, and Tongam, and for calligraphy practice, I only used a powder board. At this time, an announcement was made that a special civil service examination to commemorate the Imjin War would be held in Haeju, which became the last civil service examination in our country. One day, teacher Jong told my father, and also said that I needed to practice writing on large paper to prepare for writing the answer sheet. My father went through untold hardships to procure 5 sheets of large paper, and I practiced writing until those 5 sheets turned completely black. As the day of the exam approached, my father and I, having no money, packed enough millet to eat during the exam and followed teacher Jong to Haeju. Since we couldn't afford an inn, we secured lodging through the gibayants my father had established previously. The day of the exam arrived. Straw ropes were strung around the Gwampongak Pavilion next to the Seonwadang Hall. They said the gates would open at the appointed time, and scholars gathered, following their groups, holding up white cloth flags with their names written on them high on bamboo poles. There was the Sandong group, the Sokdam group, and so on. The scholars wore black hemp headbands and robes, pouring in after their group flags. The sight of the brave vanguard factions shouting as they tried to grab the best spots first was quite a spectacle. Originally, the custom in the examination grounds was disorder, with no distinction between old and young, high and low. Another amusing sight was the Golgwa, begging to pass, of the old scholars. They would stick their necks through the holes in the straw rope net and shout things like, "This humble person's name is so-and-so, living in a distant village. I have participated in every exam, and this year I am 70-something years old. I won't be able to participate again next time, so if I could just pass the preliminary exam this once, I would have no regrets even if I die." They would shout loudly or wail bitterly like this. It was pathetic on one hand and pitiful on the other. It was decided that teacher Jong would compose my essay and I would only write it down. But the head of our group, moved by the fact that I was taking the exam under my father's name instead of my own, to dedicate the answer sheet to him, volunteered to write it for me. It was because his handwriting was better than mine. It was regrettable that I couldn't use my own composition and handwriting, but I felt it would be good if my father could pass, even through proxy writing. Speaking of proxy writing, almost everyone was doing it. People with power and wealth all borrowed writing from good writers and handwriting from good calligraphers to take the exam. But this was still the better side. No matter how good the writing was, a single favor letter from a powerful family in Seoul, or a roll of silk given to the examiner's concubine, was a faster way to become a jinsa or pass the exam than the writing of a great scholar. Of course, writings like ours would have only served as scrap paper for the petty officials' houses and wouldn't even have caught the examiner's eye. Passing the exam and becoming a jinsa were decided in advance, and taking the exam was just an afterthought. I was greatly disappointed by this exam. I realized that no matter how hard one studied, it was a world where trying to advance and become a yangban through that was impossible. Even if one was good at writing, becoming a scribe for the children of powerful families would be the absolute best outcome. I returned home and told my father about my disappointment with the exam, and he agreed that I had rightly realized it, saying, "Then try studying geomancy, pungsu, or physiognomy, guansang. If you learn geomancy well, you can find auspicious sites for our ancestors' graves, and your descendants will enjoy prosperity. If you are skilled in physiognomy, you can recognize people well and meet sages and men of virtue." I found this advice very reasonable, asked my father to borrow the Maui Sangseo, a classic book on physiognomy, and studied it without leaving my solitary room for 3 months. The method was to put a mirror in front of me, look at my face, learn the names of the various parts, and simultaneously study the auspiciousness and inauspiciousness of my own features. No matter how much I observed my face, there were no good features like nobility or wealth, only features indicating lowliness, poverty, and misfortune. Having been disappointed at the exam grounds earlier, I had hoped to recover through physiognomy, but looking at my own face made me even more discouraged. I thought I would just live to survive like an animal and then die. I had not the slightest desire to live in the world. To me, who had fallen into such despair, the only thing that gave me hope was the following passage in the Maui Sangseo. "A good face is not as good as a good body, and a good body is not as good as a good heart." Seeing this, I firmly resolved to become a person with a good heart. But how does a person with a bad heart become a person with a good heart? To this, the Maui Sangseo gave no answer. So I closed the book on physiognomy and looked a bit at books on geomancy, but found no interest there either. This time I started reading military strategy books. I read the likes of Sonmuja, Sun Tzu, Ogija, Wu Chi, Samnyak, 3 Strategies, and Yukdo, 6 Secret Teachings. There were many things I didn't understand, but in the part discussing the qualifications of a general, even if Mount Tai collapses in front of you, do not let your mind be moved. Share the sweet and the bitter with your soldiers. Advance and retreat like a tiger. Know the enemy and know yourself, and you will not be defeated in 100 battles. This passage drew my mind. At this time, I was 17. I gathered the children of my relatives, acting as a village teacher, reading military books I didn't even understand well, and spent a year like that. At this time, various mysterious diseases were circulating everywhere. There were rumors that somewhere a true man appeared, stopped a steamship running on the sea, and only let it go after collecting taxes. That soon, Jung Dor-yeong would establish a capital at Mount Gyeryong, so one must go to the right place to become a noble in the new nation, causing some to sell their households and move to Mount Gyeryong, and so on. However, a man named Oh Ong-seon, living in a place called Gategol, about 20 ri south of our village, and a man named Choi Yu-hyun in the neighboring village, had received the way from a Donghak teacher named Choi Dom-young in Chungcheong Province, and were studying it. They wouldn't open their doors when going in and out, would suddenly appear and disappear, and since they could walk on air, they claimed they could travel to their teacher Choi Dom-young in Chungcheong Province overnight. I developed a curiosity about this thing called Donghak and decided to visit these people. As I heard from others, I abstained from meat and fish, bathed, and put on new clothes. They said this was required to be accepted. As for my appearance, I combed and braided my hair and wore a jade blue robe with a woven belt. It was the beginning of the year I turned 18. When I reached the door of O's house in Gategol, a sound of reading texts came from inside, which was different from reciting ordinary scriptures or poetry, and sounded more like singing in a chorus. I approached the gate and asked for the master of the house, and a neatly dressed young scholar wearing a tongchongwon, a type of hat, came out to greet me. When I bowed politely, he also bowed politely in return. I felt so honored that I stated my name and lineage, explaining that even if I had come of age, I could not receive a reciprocal bow from the master, a young master of a noble family, let alone that this treatment was excessive for a boy with braided hair. At this, the scholar showed a moved expression and said that because he is a Donghak believer, he follows the teacher's precepts that there is no discrimination between rich and poor, high and low, and that he treats everyone equally, so I shouldn't feel apologetic. And he asked the purpose of my visit. Hearing this, I felt as if I had come to another world. When I told him my purpose of seeking the way, he cheerfully explained the history of Donghak and the essence of its doctrines. He explained that this way was clarified by Master Suun Choijeu from Yeongdam, but that elder had already been martyred, and now his nephew, Master Haewol Choi Si-hyung, is the great master spreading the teachings. The core doctrine of this way is to have the deceitful mankind of the end times repent and become new people, and in the future to serve the true Lord of Mandate, the true King who receives the will of heaven to pacify and unify the chaotic world, and establish a new nation at Mount Geryon. Hearing this once, a feeling of great joy arose in me. For me, who had realized my bad physiognomy and sworn to become a person with a good heart, harboring God in my body and practicing the way of heaven was the most crucial thing. Moreover, as someone whose resentment of being a Sangnam was bone deep, the egalitarianism of Donghak was incredibly appreciated. Also, the talk of establishing a new nation because the fortune of the Yi dynasty was exhausted sounded very appropriate to me, who had been disappointed by the corruption of politics as seen in the Haeju exams. The desire to join the religion burned within me, and when I asked about the initiation procedure, he said that if I brought 1 mal of rice, 3 quires of white paper, and a pair of yellow candles, he would perform the initiation ceremony for me. I browsed through Donghak books such as Dongyong Daejeon, Palpyeon Gasa, and Gungolga before returning home. I told my father what I heard from O and expressed my intention to join the religion. My father immediately consented and prepared the gifts for the initiation ceremony. This is how I joined Donghak. Having joined Donghak, I studied diligently while also putting effort into folk evangelism. My father also joined. Regarding the situation at this time, few Yangbans came to Donghak, and many Sangnoms like me flocked to it. In just a few months after I joined, the number of Yeonbi, believers gained through evangelism, reached several hundreds. Thus my name became widely known, and some came seeking the way, while others spread baseless rumors about me. Having practiced Donghak, what kind of magic did you achieve? This was the question most commonly asked of me. People did not seek the way, but sought magic like sorcery. When asked such questions, I answered like this: not committing evil and practicing good is the magic of this way. This was my honest and proper answer, but the listeners seemed to think I was hiding my magic and not showing it to them. Some even said they saw Kim Chang-soo. I dropped my childhood name Chang-um and used this name from then on, walking a fathom above the ground. Rumors mixed with truths and falsehoods spread like this, and my fame spread not only throughout Hwanghae Province but as far as South Pyongan Province, so that in that year, the number of believers under me reached thousands. At the time, among the Donghak groups in Hwanghae, Pyongan, and the 2 western provinces, because I was a young person with many believers, they nicknamed me Baby Jeopju. Jeopju refers to the head of a Jeop, a local chapter, and is an official title bestowed from above. The following year, in the autumn of the Gyesa year, an official letter arrived from the great master Haewol Choi Si-hyung, ordering Oungseon, Choi Yu-hyun, and others to report the roster of their believers. When 15 highly respected doyu, scholars practicing the Donghak way, were selected to personally visit the great master from Hwanghae Province, I was also chosen. Since braided hair was considered inconvenient, I performed the coming-of-age ceremony, putting hair up in a top knot before leaving. The believers collected travel expenses for me, and as a gift for the great master, we custom-ordered special Haeju ink sticks. We traveled by land and water and arrived at Jeongan, Boeun County, in Chungcheong Province, where Master Haewol resided. Entering the village, from this house and that house, Jigi Gomji Wonwi Daegung, Sicheonju Jo Wajong, Yongse Bulmang Mansaji, The sound of reciting the incantation could be heard. On one side, groups of people were arriving to find Great Master Haewol, and on the other, groups were leaving after paying their respects. Every house was completely filled with people. We asked the receptionist to report our arrival with the roster of our group of 15 to the Great Master. About an hour later, a notice came that he was calling for the believers from Hwanghae Province. Our group of 15 followed the guide to Master Haewol's quarters and bowed together before him. The master, remaining seated, bent his upper body and placed his hands on the floor to return the bow, and briefly offered words of comfort, saying we had gone through a lot of trouble coming a long way. We presented the gifts and the roster of believers we brought, and the master called the person in charge to process them. Our purpose for coming from so far away was to see the master's noble and saintly appearance, and also hoping to receive some miraculous magic pouch from him, but there was no such thing. The master looked about 60 years old, with nicely grown sideburns, slightly dark-skinned, and his face was thin but had a clear elegance. He was wearing a large black gat and working in just his inner jacket. On a cast-iron brazier placed in front of the room door, a medicine pot was boiling with steam, giving off the smell of strong ginseng tea. They said it was for the master to drink. Inside and outside the room, several disciples were escorting him. The ones attending him most closely were Sun Young-gu, Kim Young-guk, and Park In-ho. Sun Young-gu was Weam Sun Byung-hee, a clean-cut young man who would later become the great master as Master Haewol's successor, and Kim looked about 40, resembling a simple and honest farmer. I heard these two were both sons-in-law of Master Haewol. Mr. Sun looked educated, and seeing a talisman with Cheonul Cheonsu written on it, it seemed he also had talent in calligraphy. While our group was in front of Master Haewol, a report came in. It said that Jeonbong-jun had already raised an army in Gobu, Jeolla Province. Following that, another report came. It said the magistrate of a certain county had arrested the entire family of a Doyu and confiscated their property. Hearing this report, the master took on a furious expression and said in pure Gyeongsang Province dialect, "If a tiger rushes in, should we just sit and die? Let's at least grab an oak stick and go out to fight." These words of the master were the mobilization order. The high-ranking Jeopjus, who had come from various places and were on standby, began to withdraw, seething with bloodlust like boiling water. They were going to raise armies in their respective regions and fight. Our group from Hwanghae Province also each received a certificate of appointment as Jeopju. It was stamped with a seal engraved in seal script saying, Haewol's seal, inside a headcloth. We bowed in farewell to the master, withdrew, briefly toured Mount Songni, and were on our way back to our hometown. Already, people were gathering in groups everywhere, and we frequently met people in plain clothes carrying swords. When we reached the marketplace in Gwangyewon, a Donghak army of about 10,000 men had set up camp and was inspecting travelers. What was amusing was that they had caught the Yangbans, who used to mistreat the Donghak groups in peacetime, made them sit by the roadside, and forced them to weave straw shoes. Our group showed our credentials and passed safely. On the road, we saw countless people bringing rice cooked as provisions from neighboring villages to the headquarters. We also saw farmers harvesting rice in the fields, drop their sickles, and run away upon seeing the Donghak army swarming in like the tide. And upon reaching Seoul, we met the capital guards marching towards the 3 southern provinces. When we returned to Haeju, it was September. The Donghak groups in Hwanghae Province were also agitated. Firstly, the believers' lives were unstable due to the oppression by Yangbans and officials. And secondly, official letters urging us to respond kept pouring in from the 3 southern provinces. So after a meeting of several leaders, including the 15 Jeopjus, we decided to rise up, set the location for the first General Assembly at Jukcheon Market in Haeju, and sent out official letters to believers everywhere. Since I lived at the foot of Mount Palbong, I named my chapter Palbong and made a flag made of blue fine silk with Palbong headquarters written largely on it, and raised it high with the slogan, "Reject the West, reject the Japanese, Chogyang Chokwe," written on it. Then, to fight against the capital guards and Japanese troops that would come down from Seoul to suppress us, we decided to gather those among the believers who had firearms and organize a military unit. Since I was originally a Mountain Valley guy and also a commoner, I had many Mountain Hunter believers. When I gathered them all, I had 700 soldiers with guns, making my military power superior to anyone else's chapter. We also collected a few weapons for self-defense that had been kept in the homes of nearby wealthy people. According to the strategy drawn up by the Supreme Council, we were to first capture the Haeju Fortress, the capital of Hwanghae Province, kill all the corrupt officials and Japanese, and make Palbong Jeopju Kim Chang-soo the vanguard commander. The reason for this might have been my background in military books and the many mountain hunters in my unit, but the biggest reason was probably that they didn't want to stand at the front and become cannon fodder themselves. However, I gladly held the command flag reading Vanguard, rode a horse, stood at the front, and marched toward the Haeju Fortress. We set up camp at Mount Seonyeosan, outside the west gate of the Haeju Fortress, and waited for the general attack order. Presently, the general attack order came from the general headquarters, along with the command that the operational plan was entrusted to me, the vanguard commander. I set up this plan, reported it to the headquarters, and immediately began the operation. Currently, the Capitol Guards had not yet arrived in the fortress, and there were only 200 garrison troops consisting of a ragtag crowd and 7 Japanese soldiers. I would have the advance party attack the south gate first, to draw the garrison's power there, and then I would breach the west gate. The general headquarters should observe the situation and assist whichever side was weaker. The general headquarters adopted my plan and ordered one unit to march toward the south gate. At this time, a few Japanese soldiers climbed onto the fortress wall and fired 5 or 6 test shots, which caused the advance party heading for the south gate to start running away. Seeing this, the Japanese soldiers returned and fired rapidly at the fleeing crowd. I then commanded the entire army and launched a fierce attack toward the west gate, but suddenly an order to retreat came from the general headquarters, and before we could even turn our heads, I saw the soldiers following us fleeing to the mountains and fields. I grabbed a soldier to ask the reason for the retreat, and he said it was because 3 or 4 Doyu had been shot dead outside the south gate. Since it had come to this, the vanguard unit couldn't stay alone either, so we retreated relatively orderly and decided to set up camp at the house of Governor Kwok in Hohakdong, 80 ri west of Haeju. It was a relief that the armed soldiers had hardly diminished, and almost all of them had followed. Outraged by this failure, I decided to do my utmost to create a well-trained army. I invited anyone with experience as an officer, whether a Donghak believer or not, with polite words and generous gifts, to be an instructor to train the soldiers. We did all kinds of drills, not to mention shooting, marching, and gymnastics. I believed that making a good army was the secret to winning battles. One day, 2 men asked for a meeting with me. They were Jung Deokyeon and Woo Jong-seo, who lived at the foot of Mount Guwol. When I asked the reason for their visit, their answer was surprising. They said they heard that not a single one of the Donghak army was useful, but that I was slightly better, so they came to take a look. My subordinates next to me were indignant at the extreme disrespect of their words. Instead, I reprimanded my subordinates, sent them out, and sat face to face with the 2 strange guests. I politely addressed the 2 men as teachers and said I hoped they would teach me some good strategies since they had visited me like this. Then Mr. Jong spoke with an even more arrogant attitude, saying that even if he told me the strategies, he doubted whether I would understand them or have the qualifications to execute them. Then, with an even more boastful tone, he glared at me, saying that those who act as Donghak Jeopjas are absurdly full of bravado and treat scholars like worthless grass, asking if I was not such a person too. I adopted an even more polite attitude and said, "Won't you only know that this Jeopju is different from other Jeopjus after you, teacher, have tried teaching me once?" They both seemed about 10 years older than me. Only then did Mr. Jong gladly take my hand and tell me his strategies. They were as follows. 1. Maintain strict military discipline and use polite language even when addressing enlisted men, avoiding condescension. 2. Win the hearts of the people. Strictly forbid the Donghak army from roaming civilian houses with guns, demanding grain and money like robbers. 3. Circulate letters seeking the wise and virtuous to widely gather good people. 4. Assemble the entire army at Mount Guwol and train them. 5. Confiscate 2,000 sacks of rice stockpiled by the Japanese in the 2 counties of Jeryong and Sincheon. Store them at Baekbeomilji Temple on Mount Guwol and use them as military provisions. I immediately decided to implement this plan, gathered the whole army at the assembly ground that day, declared Mr. Grol Jong as the chief strategist, Moju, and Mr. Wu as the aide, Jongsa, and directed the entire army to give them the highest salute. Then, while preparing to move the camp to Mount Guwol, one night a secret envoy arrived from Jinsa An Tae-hun in Cheonggyeong, Sincheon. Jinsa An's given name was Tae-hun, and his eldest son, Jung-gyeon, later became the An Jung-gyeon who assassinated Ito Hirobumi. He was renowned for his excellent writing and calligraphy even in Seoul, and being resourceful, even high officials in the court treated him with fear. When the Donghak group rose up, Jinsa An, in order to suppress them, set up a righteous army office at his home in Cheonggyeong, made all his sons righteous soldiers, recruited 300 hunters, and had already achieved much success in suppressing the Donghak groups within the borders of Sincheon, so every chapter feared and guarded against him. I had Chief Strategist Jong meet this secret envoy. According to his report, my main camp in Hwanghae and Jinsa An's Cheonggyeong were only 20 rai apart, but if I recklessly tried to attack Cheonggyeong and lost, it would be difficult to guarantee my life and reputation, and then a good talent would be lost. Therefore, Jinsa An sent this secret envoy out of goodwill toward me. We immediately held a staff meeting, and as a result of the discussion, a secret agreement was reached. If they do not attack me, I will not attack them, and if either side falls into a difficult situation, we will help each other. As planned, my army gathered at Mount Guwol. The rice in Jeryong and Sincheon was also moved to Baekbeomilji. When I announced that 3 mao would be given to anyone who carried 1 sack, it was all moved in 1 day. Military training was also vigorously conducted every day. Furthermore, I issued orders to all neighboring villages to expose and severely punish those claiming to be Donghak members and committing outrages among civilians. Within a few days, order was restored, and the people felt relieved. I also published a letter seeking the wise and sought out talents widely, gaining educated people like Song Jong-ho and Haeogon. At Baekbeomilji, there was a monk named Haeondang who led hundreds of monks and nuns, and I occasionally listened to his sermons. During this time, news arrived that the capital guards and Japanese troops had occupied Haeju, pacified areas like Ongjin and Gangneong, and crossed Hakneong Pass. It was not hard to imagine that their target would be Mount Guwol. However, the root of the disaster was not the capital guards or the Japanese troops, but the forces of Lee Dong-yeop, who was in the same Donghak group as me. Lee Dong-yeop was the Jeopju with the greatest power in the vicinity of Mount Guwol, and his subordinates infiltrated near my main camp and recklessly plundered. Because our army arrested and mercilessly punished them, the hostility between us deepened. On top of that, among my soldiers, those who harbored resentment after being punished under our military laws, and those who wanted to plunder freely, increasingly fled to Lee Dong-yeop's army day by day. Thus, Lee Dong-yeop's power grew day by day, while my power shrank day by day. As a result of a Supreme Council meeting, I decided to abandon the title of Donghak Jeopju and entrusted my army to Haeogon. This was not to take away my military authority, but a stratagem to save my life. Haeogon then had Song Jong-ho leave for Pyongyang with a letter of introduction for Jang Ho-min in Pyongyang, intending to resolve the matter politically by obtaining the understanding of the Hwangju military commander. At this time, my age was 19, the 12th month of the Gabo year. I developed a fever and severe headache and became bedridden. The monk Handong let me stay alone in his quarters, the josel, and personally nursed me. A few days later, my illness was identified as measles, and Handong laughed, saying, "You're a general who couldn't even handle the measles." He then selected an old monk with experience in treating measles to take charge of my care. While I was lying in my sickbed like this, one day an urgent report came that Lee Dongyup was invading Pyopsa with his entire army, followed by a chaotic barrage of gunfire, and in an instant, hand-to-hand combat erupted within the temple grounds. However, my soldiers, whose morale was already low and who had lost their commander, were routed by the sudden attack, and my main camp was overpowered by the enemy. My soldiers were fleeing in a miserable state. Presently, Lee Dongyup's command was heard. Anyone who lays a hand on Jeopju Kim will be executed. Only catch and kill that bastard Commander Lee Jong-sun, he shouted. Hearing these words, I kicked off my blanket, jumped out to the edge of the wooden porch, and shouted, Lee Jong-sun is someone who only acted under my orders, so if Lee Jong-sun has committed a crime deserving death, kill me! Lee Dongyup ordered his men to hold me so I couldn't move, dragged only Lee Jong-sun out, and shortly after a gunshot was heard from the village entrance, all of Lee Dongyup's men withdrew. Hearing that Lee Jong-sun was dead, I ran down to the village entrance. Indeed, he had been shot and fallen, and his clothes were still on fire. I held his head and wailed bitterly, then took off my jacket to wrap his head. That jacket was a silk jacket my mother had made and sent me, saying I had become a superior to others, the first one I had worn in my life. Seeing me wailing half-naked on the white snow, the villagers brought clothes and dressed me. I directed the villagers to bury Lee Jong-sun's body. Lee Jong-sun was from Jongpyeong, Hamgyong Province, and had come to live in Hwanghae Province for business. He was good at hunting with a gun, and though uneducated, he had a talent for leading people, which was why I had made him the artillery commander. After burying Lee Jong-sun, I did not return to Pyopsa, but went to Jung Deokyun's house in Busandong. Having heard what happened from me, Mr. Jung calmly said, Now that you have done all you can, brother, let's go on a peaceful journey together. He completely suppressed even my talk of avenging Lee Jong-sun. Mr. Jung said that Lee Dongyup attacking Pyopsa was like hitting himself with his own hand, and that it would hasten the capital guards and Japanese troops to attack Lee Dongyup. His words came true exactly, and while Mr. Jung and I were hiding near Monggumpo, Lee Dongyup was captured and executed. With my army at Mount Guwol and Lee Dongyup's army wiped out, the Donghak groups in Hwanghae Province were virtually annihilated. After hiding near Monggumpo for 3 months, I partnered with Mr. Jung, crossed over to Teotgol to visit my parents, and following Mr. Jung's advice, decided to seek out Jinsa-an in Cheonggyedong to entrust myself to him. As a defeated general, I felt unpleasant about going under Jinsa-an, who was once an enemy, to become like a prisoner of war. However, Mr. Jung strongly argued that Jinsa-an's character was not like that and that he deeply cherished talent, and that the secret envoy Jinsa-an sent earlier also meant I should come to him in such a situation, so I followed his words. The day after seeing my parents in our hometown of Teotgol, Mr. Jung and I immediately crossed Mount Cheonbongsan and arrived at Cheonggyedong. Cheonggyedong was surrounded by steep and beautiful peaks on all sides, with about 40 to 50 houses scattered in the village. A stream flowed in front of the village entrance, and on a rock there was an inscription carved by Jinsa-an himself, reading Cheonggyeongcheon. There was a small peak that seemed to block the village entrance, on top of which was a gun battery, and a sentry at the entrance asked who we were. After handing over our calling cards and waiting a while, permission from the commander of the righteous army was granted, and a soldier guided us to Jinsa-an's house, the righteous army office. There was a lotus pond in front of the gate with a small pavilion in the middle, which they said was where the 6 An brothers drank wine and recited poetry in normal times. On the wall of the main hall, the 3 characters for Righteous Army Office were written horizontally. Jinsa-an welcomed us in the main hall, and after exchanging greetings, his first words were, I knew Scholar Kim escaped danger at Pyopsa, but I was worried because I couldn't find your whereabouts, despite sending people to search. I am grateful you have visited like this today. And then he asked again, I heard your parents are both alive. Do they have a place to settle? Inquiring about my parents. When I said they had no particular place to settle, Jinsa-an immediately entrusted 30 armed soldiers to Oulson and gave the order, "Go to Taeokgol within today, bring Sholar Kim's parents, and commandeer carts and horses from the neighborhood to move all the belongings of their household here." In this way, our family came to live as guests in Cheonggyeong, which was in February of the Ilmi year when I was 20 years old. I stayed in Cheonggyeong for only 4 or 5 months, but that period was the most important time for me. First, it was because I came into contact with a great personality like Jinsa-an, and second, because I received the guidance of a righteous scholar like Go Salim. Jinsa-an was a scion of an old family that had lived in Haeju City for over 10 generations. His grandfather Insu served as the magistrate of Jinhae, and seeing the world gradually becoming chaotic, wished to hide himself from the world. He distributed much of his wealth to poor relatives and brought properties yielding about 300 sacks of harvest to move into Cheonggyeong, choosing it because its beautiful mountains and streams were sufficient for a refuge. At this time, the eldest grandson Jung-gun was 2 years old. Jinsa-an became a retainer of Kim Jong-han in Seoul to take the civil service exam, stayed in the capital for many years, became a Jinsa, and then gave up the ambition to serve in government. He returned home, and the 6 brothers spent their tea, me with wine and poetry, making it their joy to associate with like-minded friends. All 6 An brothers could be called literary talents, but among them, the third, Jinsa-an, had a spirit in his eyes that could overpower others, and an open and prominent disposition, so that even high officials of the court naturally felt respect and awe when facing him. Even to me, he appeared very easygoing, friendly, and polite even to the uneducated lower classes without the slightest hint of arrogance. So both upper and lower classes had favorable feelings toward him. His face was very neat and refined, but he drank excessively, so the tip of his nose was red, which was his flaw. He was good at poetry, so his poems were widely recited even then, and there were times when he enthusiastically recited his favorite works to me. He wrote the Hwangsokgong Soseo in his own handwriting, pasted it on the closet door, and when he was in the mood from drinking, he would read it aloud. At that time, Jinsa-an's eldest son, Jung-gun, was 13 years old and wore a topknot. He tied his hair tightly with a purple towel, carried a short gun called a donbangchong, and engaged in hunting every day. He was brimming with heroic spirit just to look at, and his marksmanship was the best among the soldiers of Cheonggyeong, so he never missed any beast or bird he aimed at. He always went hunting with his uncle Taegyeon. The roe deer and water deer they caught fed the soldiers and also served as snacks for the 6 Jinsa brothers' drinking parties. Jinsa's second son Jong-gon and third son Gong-gon were young masters wearing red coats and braided hair, reading books. Jinsa worried that these 2 sons didn't study enough, but he seemed to completely leave Jong-gon alone to do as he pleased. Go Salim's given name was Nungseon. He was from a family that had lived for generations in Bidong outside the west gate of Haeju. He was a disciple of Jungam Jo Jung-gyo and a fellow student of Uyam-yu In-sok. In the Haeseo region, he was a prominent scholar known for his upright conduct. He too was living in Cheonggyeong at the invitation of Jinsa-an. I first met Teacher Go in Jinsa-an's guest room. I was deeply moved by his words inviting me to come play in his guest room and visited his house the next day. With a joyful expression on his aged face, the teacher kindly welcomed me and called his eldest son Wonmyong to meet me. Wonmyong looked about 30 years old. His innate nature seemed sharp and clever, but his breadth and depth did not seem likely to succeed his father's. Wonmyong had an eldest daughter who was 15 or 16 years old. The room where Teacher Go resided was a small guest room. The room was filled with stacked books, and on the 4 walls were pasted the mottos of famous people from the past and the teacher's own realizations. The teacher sat quietly on his knees, practicing the discipline of calming the mind, and also read military books like Sonmuja and Samnyak. Teacher Go said to me that even if I went to play in Jinsa-an's guest room every day, it would be less effective for mental cultivation. So how about coming to the teacher's guest room every day to discuss worldly affairs and debate scholarship? I felt tearfully humbled and grateful that such a great teacher gave me such special recognition, and I expressed my sincere intention, mentioning my wish to become a person with a good heart and entrusting everything to Teacher Go's guidance. Having been disappointed with the civil exams, disappointed with physiognomy, and failing at Donghak, I had reached a psychological state close to self-abandonment. Could someone like me really fulfill the role of a proper human being through the guidance of a great scholar like Teacher Go? I couldn't help but doubt myself. When I told him this, Teacher Go said the following: "It is not easy for a person to even know themselves, let alone know the affairs of others. Therefore, I do not have the power to judge your future. But there is one thing I can tell you with certainty. Make the sages your goal and follow the footsteps of the sages. If you strive along this path, there are those who reach the level of the sages and those who fall short. But since you have already set your mind on becoming a person with a good heart, even if you take the wrong path a few times, as long as you do not change your original intention and correct it again and again, advance and advance again, there will surely be a day when you reach your destination. So do not agonize, just strive to act." From then on, I went to Teacher Go's guest room every day. The teacher critiqued the great figures of the past and present for me, taught me what he had studied and realized, and showed me vital passages from books like Hwaseo Aeon and Juja Baekbeom. What the teacher particularly emphasized was regarding righteousness, weary. He said that even if one has outstanding talent, if one deviates from righteousness, that talent will instead become the root of disaster. Instead of taking the method of teaching the classics in order, the teacher observed my spirit and aptitude and chose the shortcut of oral transmission and mind-to-mind instruction, mending where I was torn and filling where I was empty. Perhaps seeing me as lacking in decisiveness, the teacher said that no matter how much one knows and judges well, if one lacks the decisiveness to execute it, it is all useless, and powerfully explained the verse, Deoksu banji mujoki, hyone cholsu jungbua. Even if you grab a branch, do not put strength in your feet. Letting go of your hands while hanging from a cliff makes a true man. Sometimes Jinsa-an would visit Teacher Go, and listening to the two of them discuss ancient and modern affairs from the side was truly an incomparably interesting experience. Sometimes, after spending time at Teacher Go's house, I would eat dinner with the teacher, and we would discuss state affairs late into the night when all human traces fell silent. Teacher Go also said things like this: "Since ancient times, there is no country in the world that hasn't prospered, and no country that hasn't perished. But even in a country's perishing, there is a noble perishing and a dirty perishing. When a nation's people fight righteously and perish after exhausting their strength, that is a noble perishing. Conversely, when the people are divided into factions, one side clinging to this country and the other clinging to that country, flattering foreign powers while fighting against their own compatriots until they perish, that is a dirty perishing." Now, the power of the Japanese fills the whole country and has invaded even inside the palace, dictating the appointment and dismissal of ministers at the enemy's will. What is our country if not a second Japan? Has there ever been a country in all ages that did not perish, and has there ever been a person in the world who did not die? Now, the only thing left for us is the one deed of dying for the country, Oguk. The teacher looked at me with a sorrowful face as he said this. Overcome with indignation, I wept. To my question if there was any way to support our perishing country from falling, the teacher said it would be good to form ties with the Qing dynasty, China, and gave the following reason. The Qing dynasty will surely try to avenge their defeat in the Gabo War, First Sino-Japanese War, 1894. So, it is necessary for a suitable person among us to go to that country, investigate its political situation, form friendships with its figures, and prepare to respond to each other when the opportunity arises in the future. Moved by the teacher's words, a desire to go to the Qing dynasty arose in me. However, when I expressed the thought that what could one young person like me accomplish by going, the teacher reprimanded me for thinking that way, saying that it is necessary for everyone to execute what they believe is right even if they are alone. Rather than waiting for others to do it, if everyone does their own part, naturally the number of people doing that work will increase. some in politics, some in academia or business. If everyone becomes active in the field suited for them, those results will gather and accomplish great things. At these words, I made up my mind to leave for the Qing dynasty and told Teacher Go my intention. The teacher was greatly pleased and told me not to worry even about my parents after I left. I wondered if it would be right to inform Jinsa An of this intention out of loyalty, but Teacher Go opposed this. It seemed Jinsa An had an inclination to believe in Catholicism, and if so, it meant relying on Westerners, which goes against the great cause, so we could not discuss such important matters with him right now. However, since Jinsa An was certainly a talented person, it wouldn't be too late to discuss things with him when a good opportunity arose after I had toured the Qing dynasty. So he told me to leave without a word this time. I resolved to do whatever Teacher Go instructed and prepared for the long journey. Baekbeom's earnest wish leaves a gentle, lingering resonance in this deep night. This is the only thing I, Kim Gu, have thought and practiced all my life, that each and every one knows this country as their own and exerts all their strength for this country throughout their lives. I hope his unwavering voice saying that our soul must only be our soul has quietly reached our hearts as we live today, transcending eras. At the end of today's story, I hope you find peaceful rest along with profound emotion. Good night.